In this video, we are going to practice graphing trig functions, starting with this sine function. So, I see that I have an a value of 2. That's going to help me with the amplitude. The b value would normally be right about here. That's my a value. I don't see a b value. That means it's 1. That means that the period is going to be the normal period, which is simply 2 pi. Okay, the amplitude is going to be 2 from the a value, and because of the x plus pi over 3, okay, that's my h value. That's going to give me the phase shift, which is going to be negative pi over 3 to the left. Okay, did you catch that? Plus pi over 3 is actually to the left pi over 3. So, whenever I sketch a graph, I like to start with the phase shift, if there is one. So that's what I'm going to do right now. So I'm going to go ahead and draw my x-axis like this. Okay, and there's going to be a phase shift of pi over 3 to the left. So I'm going to go ahead and put my first mark down, and I'm going to go ahead and call that pi over 3. Actually, I'm going to call it negative pi over 3 because, like I said, this is negative pi over 3 to the left. Alright, now I need to go ahead and put 4 more marks for a period of the sine function. Whenever we graph sine or cosine, we only do one period of it. So I only need 4 marks. So here I go. 1, 2, 3, 4. Alright, this should be the end of the period. I need to label every one of these numbers. So in order to label these, I have to remember that each one of these 4 spaces is 1/4 of the period. So what is 1/4 of the period? Well, remember that the period is 2 pi. So that means 1/4 of the period, alright, 1/4 period is going to be 1/4 of the period. Alright, 1/4 of 2 pi, or 2 pi over 4, which is pi over 2. So pi over 2 is 1/4 period. So what I need to do is I need to add pi over 2 repeatedly. Every time I add pi over 2, it'll take me to the next space. Of course, if I want to add pi over 2, I need like denominators. So what I'm going to end up doing is I will turn both of these into a denominator of 6. So if I were to multiply this by 3 in the top and bottom, that's going to give me 3 pi over 6. So this is a new way of thinking of the 1/4 period that I'm going to add each time. Okay, looking at the pi over 3, the negative pi over 3, I would multiply this by 2. And that's going to give me negative 2 pi over 6. So that's a new way of thinking of my phase shift. So I'm going to take this phase shift as the starting point, and then I'm going to add 1/4 period. I'm going to add 3 pi over 6 over and over again. So negative 2 plus 3 is 1. So this would be 1 pi over 6. If I add 3 again, that would be 4 pi over 6. Add 3 again, that would be 7 pi over 6. Add 3 again, and that would be 10 pi over 6. Now I did this way down low to leave myself space to reduce if I needed to. Okay, 1 pi over 6, of course, is simply pi over 6. 4 pi over 6 reduces to 2 pi over 3. 7 pi over 6. 10 pi over 6 reduces to 5 pi over 3. Now, the y-axis. Well, you know what? Let me clean this up a little bit. Through with this, and we don't need this anymore. We need the y-axis here so we can mark the a value. The y-axis is always at 0. Sometimes 0 is one of our values. This time it's not, so we know 0 will fall between the negative and the positive. So I'm going to go ahead and put the y-axis right here, between the negative and the positive. And so this a value is 2. So I'm going to mark this as 2, and I will mark this as negative 2. Squeeze it in there. There's no vertical shift, so the midline is still going to be the x-axis. I am going to put a very faint marking up here at the a value to help guide me as I draw the graph. This is optional, but it's something I like to do. Alright, because I like to be accurate. So you can decide the degree to which you want to be on my level. Okay, so now it's time to graph. So this is a sine function, and we know that the sine function begins on the midline. Remember, we had decided ahead of time that we had a phase shift of negative pi over 3. So we know that our very first sine point of the period will be at negative pi over 3. And then we know that the sine goes up the a value, the amplitude, and it goes down back to the midline, and then it goes down the a value, and then back to the midline. So this is what the sine function is going to look like. And that is it. Is there anything else we need? No, we filled everything in, and that's the look of the graph. So we're done with number 23. Okay, that was only 7 minutes, so I'm going to go ahead and do the next one. Cosine. Same type of thing. Let's see, somewhere in the back of my mind I know that we have a vertical shift, so I'm going to keep that in mind. This will be my x-axis. Boom. The amplitude is going to be 4. I can tell that because of that a value right there. So the amplitude is going to be 4. The amplitude is always positive. Even if this was a negative 4, I would still put positive 4 right here. Now, when it comes to the period and the phase shift, I really need to rewrite this equation into a different form. So I need to factor out the b value in order to see what's actually going on. So that's what I'm going to do. This b value, the 1/3, if I pull that 1/3 outside the parentheses, then I need to take this pi over 6 and divide by 1/3. So pi over 6 divided by 1/3. Look, you multiply by the reciprocal, so it's pi over 6 times 3 over 1. That's going to be 3 pi over 6. That's going to be pi over 2. That's why on the inside of the parentheses I'm going to put x minus pi over 2. So notice that pi over 6 is not the phase shift, it's pi over 2 to the right. It's the opposite of that. So might as well write that down. The phase shift is positive pi over 2 to the right. Okay, good times, good times. Now let's talk about the period. The period is going to be affected by this b value. We know that the period will be the normal period divided by the b value. So in this case, that means since the b value is 1/3, that means the normal period divided by 1/3. 2 pi divided by the b value. But we multiply by the reciprocal, so this will be 2 pi times 3, which is 6 pi. So the period is going to be 6 pi. Whoa, not 6p, 6 pi. Silly goose. That's enough information for us to draw the graph. Whenever there is a phase shift, I always start at the phase shift. This will be no exception. So, okay, so the phase shift is pi over 2 to the right. So I'm going to put my first marking here, but I'm going to label it pi over 2, positive pi over 2, because of the phase shift. Now, for the rest of the period, I need to lay out 4 marks. So I'm going to go over 1, 2, 3, 4 spaces. That should be enough for one full period. Now, I need to label these right now. To label them, I keep in mind that every marking represents 1/4 of the period. So right now I know that the period is 6 pi. So the question is, what is 1/4 of the period? Okay, well, if the full period is 6 pi, then 1/4 period is 1/4 of 6 pi. In other words, 6 pi over 4. In other words, 3 pi over 2. This is 1/4 of the period. So, since each one of these spaces is 1/4 of the period, if I want to find the next marking, I should be able to add 1/4 of a period. I should be able to add 3 pi over 2 and get the next number. Okay, so what's pi over 2 plus 3 pi over 2? Well, wouldn't that be 4 pi over 2? Okay, what if I added another 3 pi over 2? Wouldn't that be 7 pi over 2? Another 3 pi over 2 would be 10 pi over 2. And another 3 pi over 2 would be 13 pi over 2. Alright, 4 pi over 2 reduces down to 2 pi. Can't do anything with 7 pi over 2. 10 pi over 2 is 5 pi. Can't do anything with 13 pi over 2. So, these are the x-coordinates of the 5 key points that I'm going to end up graphing. Now, I'm going to need to place the y-axis on my graph somewhere. The y-axis goes at 0. I don't see 0, and I don't have any negative numbers yet. So I need to continue to the left until I get a negative number, so I know where to put the y-axis. So I'm going to put another marking, or 2, just in case, to the left. Let's see what this number is. Well, as I went to the right, I was adding 3 pi over 2. So as I go to the left, I am going to subtract 3 pi over 2. So I've got 1 minus 3, that's negative 2. So this would be negative 2 pi over 2, which is simply negative pi. And I've already gone negative, so that's enough for me to see where the y-axis goes. The y-axis is always at 0, which has to be between a negative and a positive. So I'm going to put the y-axis right here. I am going to go ahead and erase this nonsense. I'm finished with it. Okay, here comes my y-axis. Alright, right in here somewhere. There is a vertical shift because of the +1. So I'm going to need to get that going. And then I need to watch out for an amplitude of 4. Okay, so here's my vertical shift of 1. Okay, and then the amplitude is 4, so I'm going to have to be able to go up 4 from there, like 1, 2, 3, 4. So this would actually be the number 5, wouldn't it? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. These must be labeled. Now, because of the amplitude of 4, I need to be able to go down 4. So this would be down 1, 2, 3, 4. Of course, this is negative 3. So all that has to be labeled. Right here at 1, this is the new midline because of the vertical shift. I'm going to go ahead and put a dotted line right here, representing the midline. That is mandatory. Now I'm also going to do something optional. At my A value, I'm going to put this yellow line very lightly to represent my A value. This is going to help me with my graphing. Okay, now I am ready. So as I go to do my cosine graph, I know that cosine starts off way up high at its maximum value. So remember, pi over 2, that was my phase shift. So I'm not starting on the y-axis, I'm starting at the phase shift, the pi over 2. So cosine will start right here above the pi over 2. Then cosine falls to the midline, then it falls to the lowest value, and then it returns to the midline, and then it goes to its highest value. Okay, so my cosine graph is going to look something like this. Okay, something basically like that. So that's it for the graph. I feel like I might have left something out. No? Alright, well, I guess we're done with number 24. That's going to be enough for one video. I'm going to go ahead and pause it here. The next video coming up is going to be tangent. So I think in the next video, is there no cotangent? Man, I usually like to do those together. Oh well. Stay tuned. I will see you on the next video.